All right. Today we have a guest that we've had on before for, if you guys remember, the stablecoin debate, Christian Kameir. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the DIVI Crypto podcast.
Always a pleasure.
So I really appreciate you coming back because last time we talked a little bit about something that I think is going to be one of the most pivotal moments as far as digital currency is concerned, which are CBDCs or central bank digital currencies. And you've become somewhat of an expert on this topic, right?
Well, somewhat out of necessity because it's almost self-explaining that if and when central banks decide to create a new form of payment mechanism, it's going to have a huge influence on the topic that we are interested in investing, the topic of value transfer overall. So it behooves us obviously to be part of those discussions and where we can help out, since we probably have done more research in that space than all countries combined at this point in time. So for the past 3 years, we've been solely focused on value transfer technologies. So we spent probably about 35,000 hours at this point. And the way we go about this is we're employing the scientific method as much as possible, right? And go at it from first principles. I think that's a prudent approach whenever you have specifically things like a paradigm shift. And that's kind of how we like to see this particular technology.
And so you see, good.
Yeah, so from that perspective, we put out quite a bit of content and have the benefit of having this basically peer reviewed 10,000 times at this point in time. And 600 of these peer reviews were very, very detailed, because that's essentially our due diligence process when we engage with a team that has a solution to the topic of value transfer. And so we have done this hundreds of times. And so when I look at the papers that are being circulated around the topic of CBDCs, there seems to be quite a bit of lack of this just fundamental research in terms of what is the state of different value transfer systems right now, and then also what's the state of development within the space at large, right? And to me, that's the fundamental first step. Like I always explain, is if you want to go to Paris, right, the first thing that you do is you don't buy an airplane ticket. The first thing that you need to do is establish where you are. Otherwise, you will never get to Paris, right?
Right.
And so that's something that I see every day. And a lot of these papers that I read suggest to me that they bought the ticket first, but they have not established where they actually are. And they're on their way to someplace, but if they ever get there, seems questionable.
Right. So when you say there's significant lag, do you think that's just a result of government bureaucracy, or the federations that are creating these currencies aren't doing enough research?
I mean, it's probably a combination of a number of things. I think there's not enough resources that are being assigned to that topic. It's a very complex topic. I mean, as I said, we spent the last 3 years on that and quite a bit of resources. So we have a team of 6 here, mostly data scientists. And then we have the benefit of essentially reaching out to startups in the field that also do research, right? So to the extent that we actually now started to reach back for some time to academia and our politicians to offer our help. Because what we see on our end then coming out of university and so forth is a lack of education and not the type of people that we need, that either we want to employ and or that startups that we support in the space want to employ, right? Because they just don't have the necessary education to understand where this is going. And I think one of my pet peeves is in that particular space, and that's a slide that I've seen, I don't know, dozens of times at least, maybe 100 times or more, is there will be a slide with the team, and then there will be one or more people on there that have a particular background, usually in, let's call it, financial services. But the problem with that is, and that's meant to convey credibility and so forth, right? But the problem with that is, though, that if you have a paradigm shift like the one we see with blockchain-based solutions or decentralized software solutions in general, then it's almost like going from a horse to a car, right? So in terms of, well, you might have hired the best jockey, but we were looking for a race driver. And so your jockey, who has been a banker for 10 years, wasn't really exposed to these type of development, and probably worse, he's been indoctrinated into a certain type of thinking. And we typically say, well, you don't have, there's no such thing as 20 years of banking experience. You have 20 times 1 year experience, because you've done the same thing over and over and over again, because that industry hasn't changed much, right? I mean, there's
Right.
so many things that you can do with quote unquote money. And I think we're going to go into this in some granularity, which is really required.
Yeah, so that's interesting. You're right. That's such a good point. I see that a lot too. Oh, we brought this person over from the banking world. That means we have all of the necessary required resources to implement this brand new thing. Now, this brand new thing is being implemented in many different ways. Now, being that you've researched it so much, are any implementations viable yet? I mean, are we looking at blockchain? Are we looking at traditional databases? Like, how is this actually going to come into effect?
Oh, so let me suggest something. So, as I mentioned, we employ the scientific method, and as a VC, we're doing due diligence on these things. So we have a certain procedure we go through, right, and which is pretty straightforward. And if you employ that, I think it's going to be useful regardless if you want to invest into a company or build a solution. So the first thing is always just to start with your definition. So I think we talked about this in the last podcast a little bit, but it's always worth repeating, in my opinion. It's like, as a startup, you want to first define what's your problem, right? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Well, it sounds simple enough, but I don't think that most people identify the correct problem for the most part. So a lot of times, like they identify the banks, for example, as the problem. Well, the banks solve a problem, so you got to kind of look behind the curtains and see, okay, what banks are, what are the problems that the banks are addressing, right? And so if you then go back in history, and that's unfortunately also a little bit of another challenge here, is that we see with people that have been indoctrinated in certain type of thinking and definitions coming out of business school. And we touched on that last time, is that there's still this old and definition of money that has always been, in my opinion, misguided, as in money is a unit of account, medium of exchange, and a store of value. That actually throughout history has hardly ever been true. So what Jevons, and I have his book right here, is really a booklet, but what he's really referring to there is not the functions of money, referring to the functions of a particular type of money, which is that of commodity money, which had almost no relevance throughout history ever. I mean, people always refer to the idea of having gold coins and so forth, but throughout history, that hasn't really hold true, right? Like Homo sapiens have been around for like 500,000 years, and we only started settling down 10,000 years ago. And before that, there was definitely no need, and would have been very cumbersome to carry any gold coins around. They weren't around. They wouldn't have been very practical, and humans were living in small tribes. The point there being as exchange of commercial activity, if you will, was done via, let's call it, social contracts. That has been, and today still is, the default method. So that was factually true throughout 98% of human history. So even then, after we started settling down 10,000 years ago, for the most part, people were toiling in the fields for a very long time, right? So I think people need to put this into perspective, because it's very important to see the indoctrination into certain systems, and at the same point in time, then ignore fundamentals. So the point here being, so the Industrial Revolution, which set in about mid-1800s, is probably the starting point when we can look back and compare things with what we call quote-unquote money today. But again, still, even throughout that very, very tiny history, which is like less than 0.01% of human history. Within that history, we hardly ever had commodity money in circulation. Right? It was always something else, and that something else, we should just briefly break down again, because what Jevons was referring to after like talking about barter a lot, barter was never at any particular point a relevant mechanism to facilitate commercial activity. Right? That is just a myth. So oftentimes people confuse that and say, well, it solved the barter problem. No, it did not. But regardless of that idea, so the first thing is that the function, right, that money really solves is simply language. It's simply the quantification of ones. And I'm making a parable for that. I'm going to write it out because that makes it much easier for people to comprehend than like fancy words. If you have a coconut vendor and you have 3 people standing in front of him, and the first coconut wannabe buyer looks at the coconut and thinks, oh, I'm willing to pay $5 for that. And the second person looks at the same coconut and is like, I think it's about worth €4. And then the third person is looking at the same coconut and he's like, I think I could give him probably 30 pesos. So the coconut obviously didn't change, but what it tells you, it's just the particular language the person got indoctrinated on, that he or she understands value in. So it's a particular language of value. So once then they communicate with the potential seller, they realize, oh, the seller has his own language of value. And the seller wants simonis, which is the currency of Kyrgyzstan. And he tells them it's XYZ simonis. And so what do they have to do? Well, now they have to translate, right? So they have to translate his language of value into their language of value. And then the next step after that is, okay, will you accept my $5? Right? Then you have to decide, okay, do I want this particular language, this particular medium of exchange? And so that's really the starting point. And everybody steps over the first couple of starting points, but those are the 2 main use cases, the 2 main functions of money. It's simply that of language, and then secondarily is that of agreement. Every money, as soon as you introduce a second party, is simply an agreement. That's all there is. If between you and I, we decide Pokemons are money, Pokemons are money, right? And I mean, you can see this all around the world and in different situations. And that's why mackerels of, pouches of mackerels can be money in prison, right?
Right.
Some people will know the story about that. But so once you actually get to like solving this coincidence of one's problem, right? So you realize the primary function of money then becomes spending, right? So all spent money. But over the past like 260 years approximately, there has been a very important secondary function that actually facilitates most of commercial activity, which is that of lending, and typically lending for spending. So if you call the first problem the coincidence of one's problem, like the COW or cow problem, you could call the second problem the cow now problem, right? So I want to buy something now, so I need to borrow that money. And so the larger point here being, though, to divvy that out, if you will, is that you need to realize that there's functions and there's use cases, and people conflate the two. When you do that, you're already lost, because language is the most important tool. That's the most important technology we developed. And if you're unclear about your language, right, and you start building something, the chances that you build the right tool with that misguided wording is pretty slim. And that's something that's a consistent theme. And that's why I usually look for definitions in white papers and so forth. Whenever they're missing, it's a big red flag. You should sit down and really be clear about the words that you're introducing, specifically in our case, and when we're looking at new technologies that in and of themselves bring kind of new terminologies with them. Right? That's the most important tool you need to use. It's not about blockchain. It's not about databases. It's not about bytes. It's about you understanding the language, and then you need to translate this into the appropriate code. But before you haven't really made yourself clear about what you're trying to translate, what's the point of starting to code anything, right? Anyway, that was a long, cumbersome kind of deviation of like starting out with the problem statement. But as I said, if you don't do that, it's a problem. Great problems along the line.
Well, I agree 100% because the introduction and eventual implementation of this particular technology, CBDCs, will have an impact that's incredibly long lasting, right? Just like traditional money has. So I think it's definitely relevant to take it all the way back from the source of what money is actually for. I think that's actually...
Yeah, and so I read many of the current proposals within the CBDC space, and then also it's important to understand that they are in essence a subset of stable coins, and which themselves then are a subset of value transfer overall, and all of which obviously influence each other, right? They do not stand in isolation. And the other important thing to realize is that money is mostly reliant on network effects, right? If you had all the money in the world, you wouldn't have any value because no one else had it. It would have no utility for anybody else. You had all the money in the world, and by definition, it would actually be worth nothing, right? So money really doesn't have any value outside of its utility, right? Outside of how many other people want to use it. And this comes back to, okay, how many other people are using it? How many other people are using, in this particular case, remember money being language, this particular language. So from that perspective, you can look at the landscape of money in terms of market sizes right now. So the market leader worldwide by a large margin is the US dollar. 62% of all money in the world is denominated in US dollar. Then euro being the distant second with about 20%, and then yen has a small portion of the world, is about 5%, and then you got the British pound sterling, which is about 4.5%, and all the other things, and even renminbi, don't really matter, right? And so the point there being, it's important to realize money lives mostly off its network effect. If most people use this particular language, just like if you look at the World Wide Web, most pages are in English, right? So, and even if I'm in Germany, if I'm in Japan, there's a good chance that I consume a lot of content that's written in English. And I'm a big proponent of we should just have one world language and be done with it. I think that would go a long way to world peace and so forth. But in the context of market dominance, so you're in essence, if you're creating a new unit of account or you're creating a new feature for your existing unit of account, you should realize that that's the first thing you're competing with, right? So that's the brand that you're competing with, right? It's just like you're putting out a new computer and you call it something. Well, there's other computers out there, and you compete with their functions. You also compete with their brand itself, right? So an Apple computer might be an inferior device to most PCs, but people like the brand and they're willing to pay for the brand, and they go for the brand that's trusted, right? And trust is a super important, the next very important aspect if it comes to quote unquote money in this particular sense, right?
That's right. Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, especially right now, some people are losing confidence in certain currencies, right? The dollar included. And you see the markets fluctuating as a result of that. But yet the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency. Do you see, and this is kind of off of the fundamental topic, but do you see other CBDCs becoming more relevant as far as a worldwide transfer of exchange? Like, could a digital yuan flip the dollar?
No, the chances are slim to none. But this also refers to the fact that the functions of money have split a long time ago. So it really doesn't matter. I mean, what we're talking about here is technology, right? So what label you put on that technology at the end of the day is really up to the developer, right? Yeah, and for all intents and purposes, you could show me the value of Bitcoin and Pokemon. pounds. But I just happen to like to see it in US dollars because that's what I understand the most, and that's what most merchants around me tend to accept for daily purchases. So that's simply more convenient. So I default to that, right? I think what we should do is just put maybe some quantification to that. So because what most of these papers zero in on, and it's not wrong to do this, but it's at the same point in time also somewhat myopic, as they focus on the payment function of money, which is fine as it goes. But what you then need to do, again, comes down to my travel example. You need to establish how people are paying right now. Right? So if you take the US as an example, so you have about 174 billion transactions a year. And the value in these 174 billion transactions is about just under 100 trillion. And so you want to parcel out how these are being done right now. So most of that is debit cards, which is about 40%, and then 42 or something. And then it's credit. And I'll go back to credit. That's how quote unquote payment is done. It's important to understand some nuances about credit cards, specifically, or credit. Cash is still a large portion in terms of number of transactions. Very surprisingly, is above 20%. And the last number I have is 2018. So it's really very surprising, right? That in 2018, still 24% of every transaction in the United States. So a lot of people, just from their own experience, drawing from anecdotes, if they pay on a daily basis only with debit cards, and if you're a millennial, you might never actually carry cash anymore, right? But then there's actually, I think it's around 10% of people who simply live in a cash-based society in the US, who simply don't have any of those means, and which is a good part of the motivation of creating, at least according to those particular papers, these new instruments called CBDCs. So then there's also still 2% of people writing checks, which I had never seen a check before I moved to the United States 20 years ago, in my 30 years being back in Europe. So that was a very odd thing to see, but okay, it is what it is. You need to establish that. So maybe moving backwards to credit, and that's going to become important later. So credit is significantly different from debit and cash and checks. So if you look at large money qualifications, so the way the Federal Reserve does it now, and will be important still for a little while, probably, is, so there's your M0, which is your physical cash. That's your coins and your Federal Reserve notes, and we can talk more about those. And then you got your M1, which includes that, but then also cash equivalents. Let's call it your checking account is in M1. Right? And so those you can draw from using your debit card, and you can use it to take out cash, right? And you can write checks on it. So that's that part. So credit is very, very different. And the reason why this is important to understand, it's a function of the individual. A lot of times we'll commit these semantic violations and saying the bank is giving you credit. No, credit is something that you have. The bank doesn't give you credit. The bank lends you money. Again, comes down to in this particular paradigm, you want to be very, very accurate with your language. You're building technology, right? And the first technology is your language. If you already don't know the difference of when it's lending and when it's credit, then the following will happen. So there's certain functions and certain, I call them slots, facilities you need to implement into your client technology, some of which you need to build into your server technology. And that's probably one of the largest blind spots that we've noticed across those papers. They don't differentiate much. What I mean by that is a token, if you create a new CBDC as a token, for example, right?
Right.
And obviously, you as an individual can only do something if you have a necessary software instrument that you can use to manipulate that. Let's call it wallet, for that matter, right? So then you need to check, okay, what are the facilities of the wallet? And so if you want to stick with what we've seen in a lot of those papers with the mandate that it should be the equivalent of digital cash, which I really hope to see, but I'm very, very skeptical if we see this intentionally. My expectation is we see the unintentional development of peer-to-peer cash. But so if you're really serious about that, right, then, well, there is then no KYC. There's no personal identifiable data attached and shouldn't be attached to that wallet, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, because if I give you $100, you don't have to know who I am.
Right. That's cash.
Exactly. And so obviously there's a whole another chain of problems attached to that that relate to the particular implementation of, let's call it a blockchain-based solution, decentralized software solution or whatever, which mm-hmm. has to do with the fact that even if your transaction didn't have personal identifiable data attached to it, if at any point in time there was kind of a custodial relationship to that particular asset, it becomes semi-trivial to then follow that path. So, and that's why we have all these, what I would call nefarious actors in the space that kind of facilitate the chain analysis of who is doing what, which in many ways obviously conflicts with what I call the herd immunity of the underlying network. And we simply, from that perspective, and then we're going to stop diving down this particular rabbit hole, need to implement, let's call it anonymity on the layer 1 and layer 0 level, which also kind of indicates that blockchains may actually not be the right solution. It might be DAX, it might be that might be graph-based solutions. Anyway, so maybe we'll move back to just breaking this down. So essentially, if you look at the due diligence framework, so we started out with our problem statement, right? What's the actual problem? It's not a technology problem. What is the human problem? And also identified, well, it's not the bank that are the problem. The banks solve a problem. You just want to be solving the problem better, right? And so now what we, in a way, talked about was the market size, because as a VC, the way we look at this, so what market are you addressing? And then you start out with the market size, and then you define the addressable market. And what I mean by that is, so all of those transactions I mentioned earlier, your debit cards, your cash transaction, your check transaction, so they all have typically friction attached. That friction is usually quantified in time delays and in fees and in other inconveniences, like having to fill out forms when you're sending more than $10,000 and other erroneous ideas that regulators have introduced over the years, right, which frankly shouldn't exist. But that's neither here nor there. I'm a technologist at heart, so I think technology will solve for the problems that regulation introduces at the end of the day.
I hope so.
So to get to your total addressable market, and that's what we do all day long, and that's what I request from every entrepreneur in that space. What you need to identify, so identify the friction, right? So what are the time delays, what are the fees attached to that, and parcel that out. So because if you're introducing something new and if you expect market adoption, which we'll get into, you need to typically, from where we're standing, deliver three things. You need to be usually cheaper, faster, and then better in some form. And we can break out better, but faster is relatively easy, right? So the settlement for ACH transactions takes 90 days when it's actually settled. So a lot of times, that's the other thing that I seem to anecdotally have noticed across those papers, that the authors a lot of times use payment and settlement synonymous. And needless to say, you cannot do this if you're building technologies within that space. This is an enormous difference. So you want to be very, very accurate about what is payment, because payment for most people, they experience this as an instant thing, right? So payment in their mind is not a problem. Again, if you want to solve a problem, it needs to be a problem to the human. If you're just solving a technical problem, well, you didn't address a new market, right? And so the point here being is, who's your client, right? which goes then down to who are we actually addressing. So what's the addressable market within that? So how can you be better? It's like how can your technology be better, but then actually solve a human problem? So either in terms of analytics or quote unquote programmable money, which is a term that's been thrown around a lot, which I think that part has kind of already mostly solved beforehand. And so I think there's this gap between what technologists are doing right now and what policymakers are doing and trying to move this forward. And they're coming at this from different angles, which is totally fine. It's just important that both parties realize where they are. So that we talked about mostly right now about the payment function. And remember, I mean, the two use cases for money is spending and lending. That's it. You can break it down from there. And by the way, it's important again to understand, so the function of money is language. The use case is spending, lending. So, and the way to remember that, for example, is here. So the function of a hammer is to centralize the centrifugal force, right? And then the use case is typically you put a nail in the wall.
Right.
You can, right? So that's how you differentiate function and use cases, which Jevons didn't manage to do. He created this kind of misguided definition that everybody is using. You also obviously can do other things with a hammer, as in like harm another life. I don't recommend it, but the reason why I'm bringing this up is we kind of defaulted to this idea of, well, you can do harm with money, quote unquote. You can do nefarious things with money. So we need to deputize financial service providers to then spy on you proactively. As in, you're buying a hammer, I assume you want to hit someone in the head. No, I assume you want to put a nail in the wall. That would be the right assumption, right?
Right.
Anyway, that's something I used to be a lawyer a long time ago, and to me, it's always very surprising that people don't push back against these obvious misguided ideas and overwhelming introduction of deputization of private companies for what should be public functions, which that's another part to realize. And that's, I think, what every paper that I read seemed to have identified. Money, as far as money being created by governments or central banks, is a sort of a public good, a public function, right? And from that aspect, we should have fixed that public function a long time ago. Think about it in these terms. So there's 10% of the US population, not let alone to talk about other countries, that cannot get a bank account, right? So that's like 10%, if you want to look at the public function component of money, 10% of people not being able to get on the freeway.
Yeah.
They just have to use country roads because,
right.
Well,
horse and buggy.
I don't know why, but for whatever reason. And we have done little to fix that. And I'm concerned that even with the current movements within that direction, there's no expectations, as far as I can tell, that anybody from the public sector is going to introduce a viable solution within the next 3 to 5 years. By then, the topic has largely moved on, in my opinion. But yeah, so moving this back. So what we're talking about now is, let's talk about the product itself. So we already obviously have a lot of stablecoins, right? So and people try to come up with different classifications, and that's largely somewhat of a fruitless exercise. We have algorithmic stablecoins, right? And they have certain functions, quote unquote. And then we have pegs, and I think most people who will listen to this particular podcast will realize, well, USDT Tether is the most used stable coin, and it's really a peg, and the use case is really that of speculating on centralized exchanges. That's it, right? No one's going out and using Tether to pay for milk and their orange.
No, it's a way to stay in crypto while you're trading.
So yeah, so the point that being is it's not used for spending. So it's just a particular use case within a very insulated space. So to call that a competitor is probably not really fair. But the other point there is that a lot of these quote unquote functions will probably be functions not of the token. And you know what I typically say, the number of cryptocurrencies we need is anywhere between 0 and 1. It's just a lot of people that don't understand the current value transfer system mechanics, right? And so those functions you want to build into your client software at the end of the day, right? So all the function will obviously, in my opinion, live there. So anyhow, so we haven't talked much about the actual main use case of money today, which is lending, right? So, and the way I like to look at the overall topic of money is in these broad buckets, and they are also hardly understood, it seems, and also not mentioned at all in those papers. It's like, who gets to create money today is one big part, and it's actually mostly the commercial banks. I think we touched on it before. The commercial banks create money via lending. This is money from nothing, right? And this is money that hasn't existed. And yeah, that's also the money that's causing inflation. But maybe we don't bring this particular topic up in this discussion, but I think it's very important to understand that who gets to create money, then who gets to store money, who gets to move money, and then also who gets to remove money, right? Mm-hmm. So right now you want to identify, okay, who are these actors right now? So who gets to create money? Mostly commercial banks. Then the Federal Reserve gets to create a little bit of that. Who gets to store money? Well, the digital form of money that, and again, the default medium of exchange has been bytes for decades. Please stop saying stuff like Bitcoin is a medium of exchange. It's not. It's also bytes. So who gets to store those particular bytes? Well, right now you need to have certain licenses, and most of these lie with banks, and so they store this type of digital money. They create it in this form as well. So they create it into mortgages. And then so this is one form of lending, and that's the largest form of lending. This is, let me look at my numbers here. So this is about 36% of the total money supply right now.
Is mortgages.
That is mortgages. So if you look at overall money, and it might be a little unfair the way I'm doing this, I'm rethinking this at the moment, but it seems to be making intuitive sense. I'll publish it at some point in time for wider discussion. But right now, the way I look at this, so 36% of the money that's out there right now in our economy here in the United States has been created for mortgages. And that is the largest source of inflation. And the main inflation there is the inflation of the asset. And then the secondary inflation is the inflation to the base. And so in terms of purchasing power, unfortunately, that's not being put into the metrics. But if you put it into the metrics, then the actual inflation year over year is above 12%.
Right.
Anyway, so then the second largest bucket, which is maybe surprising, is certificate of deposits. And that's where I expect a lot of movement, because that's about,
really,
yeah, because that's about 29%, based on the latest number that I looked at. So almost a third of money out there, right? And there it's kind of split between, this has been either created by commercial banks or the Federal Reserve, but that's also lending. It's just lending by misguided consumers to banks. And misguided because right now your interest rate is below the inflation rate.
Yeah, you're losing money just by holding it.
Yes. So not really a prudent exercise. And if you're in the DeFi markets, obviously you can do much more. But unfortunately, for most people, the DeFi markets are kind of a mystery at the moment. So we won't be talking about that. So then about 23% of current money supply is based on corporate debt. I need to kind of break this down because I'm unclear how much of that is new money, how much of that is existing money, and how much does it add to inflation. Anecdotally, I've seen some articles that attribute a lot of that to new money creation and then to the inflation of the stock market specifically. But anyway, so then you got larger buckets like student loans and auto loans, but then maybe back to credit cards. Credit cards it's a large bucket, but again, it's important to understand credit is a function of the individual, right? So it's not part of the money supply. Anyway, so the point of this exercise is if you're addressing a new form of money movement, ideally, at least in my mind, you want to go at it from first principles. So as in, well, if you're creating this new unit and it moves in certain ways, well, I think it would be very useful to implement a way of tracking this, right? As in, it's not too easy right now to see what was money being created for, who created it, and so forth. I think there's a lot of value to be had if that was transparent and if it was transparent to everybody, because again, it comes back to money being a public good. Shouldn't we all know who creates money at any given point in time? Should we all be able to use a block explorer and see, oh, there's new money, and who created it for, and what was it created for, so we can have more honest debates about, okay, well, what is actually a useful reason to create new money, and have my own opinions on that. They don't really matter, but for me, it's about like the starting point is quantifying and qualifying these. And the only way of doing this is introduce that technology at the inception of new money. So that's kind of the final point. And so I actually put forth very, very specific ideas to various teams around the world that that are working on these CBDC ideas for a nomenclature, as in who created it, for what reason, and what are the useful things to track. Not for the purpose of nailing down the individual person and or entity, but for the purpose of getting kind of instant macroeconomic data that is tied to the creation and movement of money. So, and then we already talked about who gets to move, quote unquote, money, right? And how that's being done right now. Again, for the consumer, a lot of times it's not a problem. So who these solutions might mostly address is in that case businesses. But then the first business is probably being the banks themselves, right? As in, it's usually this falls into the bucket of quote unquote wholesale CBDC, right? Because right now, the one of the main reasons that if I send you $10 from my bank account, you're banking at a different bank, that this $10 seems to disappear for 24 hours is that they're using different technologies and have to reconcile overnight. So even if you're using newer technologies like the Zells of the world, etc., those are just agreements. So this has nothing to do with technology. These are just agreements that simulate instant settlement. They aren't instant settlement, actually.
It's pretty much the same thing as going on in the background, like when you use a Zelle or similar technology. Correct. It's just like an optimistic way of showing the consumer that the money's gone.
And so, what we talked about for the most part here is like identify what is the different market sizes, right? So, and the one part here is what is the friction right now that you're addressing, what is the opportunity, right? If you were to introduce a commercial solution, if you're not introducing a CBDC. And I think CBDCs then can take their lessons from there. And right now we don't have great lessons, right? But a lot of that has to do with those on and what I call the on and off ramps being still laden with friction, like the interaction of the legacy financial systems. That's why it's always so clear to me when people refer to things like PayPal and so forth as fintech. There's nothing fintech about that. It's window dressing. They're still interacting with the legacy financial systems. Like the first fintech we had are blockchain-based solutions, and we still don't have peer-to-peer digital cash, obviously.
Right.
So if and when you have done your homework, you identified your market sizes, your competitor, and so forth. Then we'll finally get to some form of technical due diligence. This is typically where these papers tend to start. A lot of times it's like, oh, here are these like 5 things in payment that we want to address, and this is how we think we can address them.
Mm-hmm. But they forgot to say, this is why.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
Well, and so then we eventually getting then to the go-to-market strategy, right? We talked a lot about who are the actual people that have a problem right now. So there's, in broad strokes, 2 kinds, right? So there's the people that actually don't have access to commercial banking accounts for whatever reason it might be. And then there's merchants who have to live with whatever commercial bank dictates them in terms of fees and other erroneous ideas that the bank might want to introduce into that exchange that you and I have when we exchange value, which that seems very odd in a way, right? Specifically, if you consider this as a public good, why, if we have a private interaction commercially, why do we have to necessarily turn to something that's government created and inflationary, which comes down to one particular important like prediction maybe. So we talked about those different classes of money, with M0 being cash, like physical cash, and M1 being your checking account. I expect those 2 classes to go up in velocity, as in the number of times they turn over. And an interesting indicator, it doesn't like compare all that well, but it was the early example of Tether. Tether's velocity, the number of times one Tether turns over in a given day might be, I forgot, let's say 4 or 5 times. So the entire market cap of Tether, like if the market cap is, I forgot what it is. What is it right now? 10 billion, right? Then you will see that the velocity is like 48 billion. So it's like 4.8 in velocity, which 4.8 is about the velocity of a US dollar in a quarter. So the point here being is, so yeah, you got very efficient, albeit mostly these are centralized systems, obviously, where they're being used right now, but there's no reason that they have to be centralized systems, right? They should be a decentralized system. So one thing that seems to be almost self-explaining, that every fiat is inflationary, some more, some less, and a lot of the actual numbers are sort of propaganda, but it doesn't really matter. The point being is you don't want to hold on to anything that's inflationary, right, for longer than you need to. And the usual example when I talk about that topic is you already don't keep $1 million in your checking account, or any like larger amounts that you personally don't expect to spend within the foreseeable future. So what if your wallet would just allocate this usefully at any given time, and you could instantly then, if someone wants payment in fiat, swap into that fiat. So how much of M1 would you hold at any given point in time? Then the answer is 0, right? The velocity will go up, but there wouldn't actually be any money in there. So right now, if you have money in your checking account, the bank gets to use that. And remember, I told you earlier that CDs is the second largest group of lending, but that's lending of misguided lending from consumers to banks, and in the process losing money. So if there was a way to optimize that, which there is obviously, but if that particular optimization was available to everybody by default in the digital wallet, so how much money do you expect would people lend to commercial banks?
None.
So now we're adding this up. So the revenue that banks make today from payments, about 30% of their revenue, right? So they have a few $1 billion usually from consumer that lend money to them, and then they have about just under shy of $1 billion in M1. So we're gonna my expectation is that's all gonna go away in very short order, right? And yeah, unfortunately, the problem still today are those on and off ramps, and this CBDC would go a very long way, albeit if it truly will take another 3 to 5 years, it seems way more likely that some smaller nation that is pegging its own currency to the US dollar, kind of by accident, is going to roll out a peer-to-peer cash, in my opinion.
But let me ask you something. Let me ask you something really, really quick.
Sure.
Because doesn't this create somewhat of a paradox? We have the CBDC that's issued by, the central bank. We want to get away from the M1 deposit to them. Will this be possible? Will we be able to, interact with the CBDCs on a technical level? Won't they just close source it?
Yeah, and so that was a topic I actually wanted to bring up. Perfect softball here. So remember, money lives off network effects. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's like this would become the VPN to the World Wide Web or internet. Sure, but we will just least cost around it, right? We'll do cost routing around it, and this is already being done right now. In my opinion, there's little you could do about that because it would require such an amount of coordination, right? So there's at least a dozen countries who peg their own currency to the US dollar, right? Mm-hmm. So my expectation is, if you look at it from a friction perspective, the US dollar being already 60% of all money in circulation. So once you have something that's the equivalent of digital cash denominated in US dollar, and it's issued by some nation state, doesn't really matter which one this is, to be honest. People will trust it enough because remember, if there's no need for M0 and M1, do you care what state it issues? People don't care, as we noticed from our short history in the stablecoin space, that there was some rumors about Tether not being actually fully backed. Because the reason I don't care is because it's just an instant exchange usually. It's like the exposure, the risk exposure that you have is very, very little.
Right. It's not going to crumble for the 10 minutes that you're using it.
It's seconds, right? You don't actually hold on to it, which comes down to the remaining function of fiat is simply that of unit of account. It's really just the label that you like to see. And we just attach some legacy technology called databases usually to that. But once we remove that, well, there go all your limitations with that, because you don't store much value in fiat at all, right? You wouldn't want to. It's not a good idea. So if you don't have to at all for more than a nanosecond, if you're only using it for payment and only for a nanosecond, so it becomes more or less irrelevant. And what would happen if someone was to then trying to inflate a particular currency? Well, you will immediately least cost around that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in essence, that's what we're always seeing the whole DeFi space. At the moment, it's at this kind of MMORPG space. There's still a multi-massive online player games. Have now turned to that same label, but I've been using this because it's fine. I mean, I think that's a good thing. I think we should have done this with all financial systems to start with. It's like, as children, we play and learn. That's what we do, right? But for some reason, we haven't done this with important topics like our financial system. We should have done the same thing, and that's kind of what's happening right now. And so eventually, at scale, once we can extend the privilege of using these tools to everybody in the world by default, specifically those who aren't actually included in our financial systems at all today, 1.7 billion, by the way, then just like the goat herder in sub-Saharan Africa who never had a rotary phone and now has a smartphone, will have a bank on his phone and would be very surprised when he first encounters a bank what they are good for. So like a physical bank, just like I don't expect that any 10-year-old that's around today will ever see much need to go into a bank, right? I mean,
Right.
they might have still some form of limited functions, but the example I typically make for that is, so how many dispatchers do you need once you have one Uber app, right? And so we'll probably have a lot of like apps that, and you can already see those if you're paying attention, right? So you can already see where they facilitate what banks do today at scale for a fraction of what the banks are introducing in terms of fees and time delays and so forth. So
yeah, and without the administrative burden.
Yeah. So, but now we're kind of going more towards like the big picture. So maybe to pull this back to the CBDC. So that's really missing from those discussions, unfortunately, right? So if you don't consider this, I don't really see how you can build a viable thing, because we are just simply running our due diligence process across those implementations, and right now none of these proposals are viable, or, well, I'm reluctant to call them not even worth discussing, because I want to discuss with them, right? I want to make sure that people who are working on this actually expand their horizons and get the right tools at their disposals to realize this is the current technologies, and also like where are we in the state of value transfer systems today. And
yeah,
I'm not sure that we have the right mix of people that are working on this yet, right?
It's still early, right? I mean, we're talking about something that was introduced just a few years ago,
well,
at least in a functional way, right?
Actually, no. And so Deutsche Bank, for example, already had, well, David Cham called some digital bearer instrument. I disagree with that characterization to some degree, but I wouldn't want to argue technology with David. But they were already using DigiCash. You probably have heard that term before, since you did.
I have, yeah.
Deutsche Bank was using DigiCash in their back office in 1999. So that's over 20 years ago. They stopped it, but I mean, this is very close to what people are talking about today, right? But that was 20 years ago, and they stopped it. It comes down to like a misaligned incentive system yet again, right? If your business is to make money out of this inefficiencies by fees and fines and other things, just simply being able to hold on that money, like I forgot what the actual number of float is, but the actual number of float at any given point in time. So the money that I send you that is not in your account is not in my account. So that's the float in simple terms.
Yeah, it's a staggering figure, I'm sure.
It is a large figure. So, but so that float is used, right, by the intermediaries, and it's pretty profitable, you know. So again, it's a misaligned incentive system. I don't have the incentive to disrupt myself. So that's why to expect help from that angle is probably misguided. And it's more likely, yet again, that private industry will develop something and then it seeps over at some point in time. You can't uninvent it anymore, right? So it's like you're done. So like once there's one phone carrier who offers all you can eat phone services for $50 a month, well, unless the other phone carriers will join that program, they probably won't have many customers that want to pay by the minute, right? It's the same, very much the same with money, and it should have gone by the wayside 20 years ago, really.
It's crazy how long these things take to, come into play. Even blockchain, there are early discussions about it dating back to like the 70s, right? At least concepts relating to what ended up becoming blockchain and cryptocurrency and things like that. And now we're just only seeing even basic implementations now, decades later, and it's still, as you say, incredibly friction heavy.
Yeah,
So
and that's something I honestly still need to spend more time on. There is a reasonable chance that blockchains won't be the right technology for this. Right? We touched
yeah,
it a little bit earlier. Chances are all of these solutions have to be DAGs, right? And mostly though, because of the implication it has for PID, for personal identifiable data, and certain jurisdictions, because even, and that's a topic for another day, a larger topic than CBDCs altogether, but it's interwoven and also not much discussed, unfortunately, in those papers outside of this idea of privacy. It's much more than privacy. Privacy is mostly not interesting to people. They hear it and their eyes glare over it. So you need to put this into actual like rights terms. What I mean by that is, so if and when you actually have something resembling SSI, self-sovereign identity, which is also kind of a funny term, but then you can actually facilitate peer-to-peer value transfer. So obviously, as long as you still have some entity involved that needs to do KYC on you, then you voided the entire idea of peer-to-peer transfer.
right. Yeah, it all goes back to that $100 you gave me in the beginning. I didn't
Yes.
know your name,
Uh,
you know?
Yeah, exactly. And so you need to, in essence, solve both. And that's, again, it's sort of a call to action, like here. And I'm curating an event right now for a standards organization where I'm sharing, not sharing, but I'm part of the board that consults on the technology implementation.
Oh,
And
cool.
we want to talk. We want to bring the experts in that space to, and by space I mean like the intersection of what I call identity, blockchain, and their particular travel. Because in
Mhm.
my opinion, it's probably most likely industry where a standard that will stick and be overarchingly used will be created, right? And again, this is like turning this back to CBDCs. CBDCs need that too, right? You need to have a solid solution that addresses personal identifiable data in
Right.
order for actually to create peer-to-peer cash. Unless and if, which is totally fine by me, unless and if you really just create a peer-to-peer bearer instrument and there's no need for anything else. But the point there being, as remember, we talked about all these other forms of money out there, right? So how they were being created, for what reason. So there is obviously points in time where you need that, as in, yeah, you need to know who owns that house, for example, in very
Yeah.
simple terms. And the larger point there being as that most assets, or more correctly, most rights that um, you're transferring to a person who then gets to take ownership over it, which is a very important distinction to make, and doesn't seem to be understood by some of the authors of the paper. So if I give you a paper note right now, do you own the paper note? If you like the $10 I
Yeah.
give you, do you own it?
Yeah, I mean, it's in my hand, right?
But you don't own it. Would it surprise you that you don't own it?
How do you mean?
Well, you possess it, yes, and
Hmm.
you get limited usage rights to it.
Hmm.
If you destroy it, you could go to prison. This is property of the Federal Reserve.
I see. I see where you're going with
You
that.
don't get to
Sure.
own it. You get to possess it and use it in a particular way. Actually, if you do anything to that particular instrument that makes it so that it can be used for its intended purpose, it's a felony. You can go to prison for 6 months for it.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah.
so you can't actually own it, because yeah, if I buy a coconut from you, I give you the $5 and you give me the coconut, I can do whatever I want. The coconut is my property. I can destroy it, I can smash it, I can eat it. But you, in return, you just get limited usage rights to that particular instrument. And again, all of these instruments that you would be getting right now, they come with a history. They also come with obligations, like I just mentioned, that are particular to certain jurisdictions and so forth, right? You get capital controls, you can move certain things and so forth. So comes back to, well, if you're actually introducing digital bearer instruments, which is part of every paper's discussion, is like, how do you quote unquote enforce EML rules and things of that nature? Which comes down to my earlier point. That's the hammer analogy. It's like I'm buying the hammer. Just assume I'm gonna put a nail in the wall with it. I'm not gonna hit someone over the head. But why are you doing this? It's the wrong entry point. So the problem here is that needs to be identified and discussed in more detail. The original implementation of money and the way we are creating it and the way we are controlling it has been problematic. Let's call it this way. It has been very problematic. And so if you're trying to keep these particular limitations with that new instrument, I don't think it's going to be viable, because there is going to be something that is actually going to be peer-to-peer cash. And it seems unlikely at this point in time that this is going to be intentionally be created by a nation. Say, I very much expect this to be unintentional, kind of like the Berlin Wall came down. Unintentional.
Yeah. I can't see a government intentionally creating something that can't be tracked. Although cash is to some extent that way. We've, as you said yourself, most of it is debit cards now, or credit cards, and some of it's cash, and some, for some reason, checks. But credit and debit are easily tracked. So, but for situations in which provenance is important, like you said, it makes sense. Buying a house, art, things like that, where you want to know that it came from the person and belongs to the person.
Yeah, so that comes down to, like, so every money is a contract, remember? Every piece of money is a contract. So all of these other things are also obviously contracts. At the end of the day, we're talking about legal technology, right? And so all of these other instruments like mortgages and so forth, they're all contracts. They might be denominated in using a particular unit of account. So I like to think of all of these particular contracts and the way they're being created kind of as metadata. So you have an entry in your account log and it says 500,000, and depending on what side of the ledger it is, it's either an obligation or it's an asset, a value of yours, right? And in my mind, that's obviously what we want to see in a way, right? So if you have your personal wallet, you want to be able to custody all of your assets in that wallet, right? And for that to happen, right, you need to consider all those other different things, quote unquote, riots mostly, that are using this unit of account. Whereas at the end of the day, in a perfect world, you wouldn't have any unit of accounts anymore anyway. As in, it's just numbers, right? Which they already are, obviously, and we're just using it for understanding. But this comes down to, if we all spoke one language around the world, it would go a long way, obviously, for understanding each other. The same holds true for value. And so at that point in time, if you see a number here on a banana, right, you assume it's US dollar, even if it doesn't have the US dollar sign attached to that, right? In another country, you have a different expectation. But how many voice of IP protocols do we have, right? But we have one. That's why we can talk right now.
Right.
And so the value transfers is mostly a human commercial coordination problem, right? That's why I'm working on this like thesis paper, like which I call commercial coordination theory. As in, so the point there being is that you want to use the byte level to coordinate atoms, the physical level, right? And so that's what DAGs and decentralized software solutions are ideally suited to do.
It's I'm excited to read that because it can go so deep, much like this conversation has. And you've been so generous with your time. I know that we're coming close to the hour here, and I don't want to take up all of it. Is there anything we missed? I feel like we've talked about so much.
No, I think because I tend to go down deep rabbit holes because unfortunately there's, in my opinion, not a whole lot out there. What I'm doing right now is kind of summarizing the VC method to look into the viability of technology, right? And then apply this very specifically, which you already obviously have been doing to all the DIVI projects, but then write it in a way that's easier understandable. I'm going to share this for peer review, and then I'm going to share it with those teams that are working on those CBDCs for their contemplation and consideration. Because right now, and I really haven't done this at scale. I didn't really have the time to do this. I just did it exemplary. But right now, anecdotally, I think none of these concepts that they're introducing are viable. So what I mean by that is that they're just not addressing the bigger picture, right? So in that sense, to miss the mark is almost inevitable, right? If you don't address, let's call it all the money, what's the point in addressing like some subset of that? And then, because you know the old adage of Gresham's law, right? Which is kind of funny that they assigned it to Gresham because that's a law that actually predates Christ. Which is simply that bad money drives good money out of circulation, right? So if you have something that's better money, i.e., it was usually the analogy and metaphor was being made for like gold coins and stuff, right? It's like I'll keep the gold coin, I'll give you that paper that that gives you the right to the gold coin, but I'm going to hold on to the gold coin, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So the point there being though is like if you look at the M0, M1. So yeah, you don't want to hold on to that. It's inflation, right? So if you can move it easily into something else, specifically something that pays you, and if there's nothing you need to do other than download this particular software that just makes it so, then you would just do it. Now the topic and task for the next couple of years, which is something I've been asking for 3 years, is to just focus on making that possible. It's like, you know what I mean? It's like, and there's too few teams working on that. Everybody's kind of working on this meta level in this big MMORPG. Again, I think that's a good thing, but at the same point in time, the real value is always being created in the on and off ramp, right? It comes back to the thing that I keep leaving everybody with. It's like end users never adopted voice over IP. They adopted Skype, they adopted WhatsApp. You ask them if they adopted voice over IP, you get a blank stare from 90% obviously, right? So that's why if you ask your mom about Aave or DAI or something, she's like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what you're talking about. Mom, you should be using DAI. It's a lot of interest. Mom was like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen, right? So, again, they're like creating new units of account. It's like creating a new language. And as a person trying to get your product to market, that's probably the worst thing you can do, introduce a new language that people need to learn in order to use your products, right?
Right. Yeah, better to make the current languages more understandable, right?
No, people have their current language. Don't even try. Your job as a technologist is not to ask users to adapt your technology. It's your job to adapt your technology to the user.
That's great advice.
Yeah, and yeah, that's why I still, after 5 years, still get emails, cryptocurrency adoption, Bitcoin adoption, blockchain adoption. It's like, no, no, that is just something very naive and very silly to say these things, right? It's like there is no such thing. Your job is to adapt your technology so the user doesn't have to learn your new language, right? The best technology is those that you don't understand, don't perceive, don't have to understand, don't perceive, right? You flip the switch, the light comes on. There's probably not too many people who would know how incandescent light bulbs are being manufactured and wires are being stolen. And neither should they don't care and they shouldn't care, right? And in my opinion, that should particularly hold true for a thing that you use on a daily basis to purchase your daily needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There specifically, and money in general.
Yeah, we've said it for a long time. Once this technology exists in the background, we'll stop talking about mass adoption and all of those, as you say, silly things.
Yeah. So number of cryptocurrencies we need is somewhere between 0 and 1.
And that one is DIVI, right?
The one is DIVI.
Well, Christian, I can't thank you enough for joining me today on the DIVI Crypto Podcast. As always, for the listeners or viewers in this case, you can find all of the information about Sustini Capital, Christian Kameir, on our show notes on the blog or in the description of the video. Christian, you have anything you want to sign off with before we end?
No, I'm still looking for intelligent people to join our discussion and event on the topic of addressing identity. And I usually use these air quotes. I'm trying to lose those, but really from a legal perspective, we're talking about agency here. So it's the control of your, not only your data, most importantly of your attention. So that's going to be a much larger topic for a later date. But yeah, I looked at not a couple of hundred, but probably like 150, some project in that space that use that term identity. So I'm very interested in identity-related solutions. Those are the bottleneck, right? And they're the bottleneck to CBDCs, but they're the bottleneck to any type of value transfer. And it's a very, very dangerous point in time in technology history that we're reaching here, because if we get this wrong, it's going to have really dire consequences. So if we don't have the technology that serves us, but that will serve, let's call it the state. I mean, the state isn't a real thing, but that doesn't actually put us into the driver's seat. That's kind of where we are right now, and that's where we're heading ever much more. Like, we, in simple terms, the battle cry here is we need to stop companies that offer social engineering as a service and reverse that model, right? So that they can be of service to the individual again. So the call to action is, if you're developing something in that space, and it could be the underlying protocols, if you will, layer 0 protocols, the DAX, but then also if you have a understanding of legal technology, reach out to me.
There you have it. And by now, if you've listened to the entire podcast, you should know exactly how to set up your pitch deck and your white paper to reach out to Christian. Make sure you do that. Once again, Christian Kameir, thank you so much for coming on. For the viewers and listeners, I will see you next time.